Mr. Johnson stood at the kitchen counter, his strong hands nervously arranging a plate of chocolate chip cookies. His eyes, deep pools of concern, flicked repeatedly to the clock hanging on the wall. The steady tick-tock seemed to echo his growing unease as he waited for the familiar sound of the front door opening. Mr. Johnson's face lit up with anticipation, but the smile froze on his lips as he caught sight of his daughter. Maya slipped through the door like a shadow, her small frame hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. Her backpack, adorned with colorful pins and keychains that usually jingled merrily, hung limp and silent from her shoulders. "Hey, sweetheart," Mr. Johnson called out, his voice warm and inviting. "I made your favorite." But Maya was already halfway up the stairs, her footsteps quick and light, as if trying to outrun something unseen. The slam of her bedroom door reverberated through the house, leaving a hollow silence in its wake. Mr. Johnson's hand hovered over the plate of cookies, uncertainty etched across his features. He had seen the redness rimming Maya's eyes, the telltale glisten of tears barely held at bay. It was a sight that had become all too familiar in recent weeks, each day carving deeper lines of worry into his face. Upstairs, behind the closed door adorned with a glittery M, Maya curled up on her bed. Her room, once a vibrant explosion of color and creativity, now seemed muted. Stuffed animals that used to stand guard now slumped dejectedly, as if sensing their owner's distress. Drawings that had once proudly displayed her artistic talent lay crumpled in the wastepaper basket, dreams discarded. Maya buried her face in her pillow, muffling the sobs that racked her small body. Tears soaked into the fabric, carrying with them the weight of unspoken hurts and fears. In the fading light, a framed photograph on her nightstand caught a glint of sunlight. It showed a younger Maya, gap-toothed and beaming, on her first day at her old school. The contrast between that carefree child and the one now huddled on the bed was stark and heart-wrenching. Downstairs, Mr. Johnson paced the living room, his footsteps heavy with indecision. His eyes kept darting to the staircase, every fiber of his being urging him to rush up and comfort his daughter. But years of parenting had taught him the delicate balance between protection and suffocation. He knew that sometimes love meant giving space, even when every instinct screamed otherwise. As night fell, the house seemed to hold its breath. The usual sounds of laughter and chatter that typically filled the evening hours were conspicuously absent. Instead, there was only the muffled sound of Maya's occasional sniffles and the restless movements of her father downstairs. Mr. Johnson found himself standing before the mantel, his gaze fixed on the family photos displayed there. Images of happier times stared back at him. Maya's first bicycle ride, family picnics in the park, her proud grin as she held up a science fair trophy. Each snapshot was a reminder of the vibrant, joyful child his daughter had once been. His fingers traced the edge of a recent photo, taken just before they had moved to this new neighborhood. Maya stood between her parents, her smile wide and genuine, eyes sparkling with excitement for the adventures that lay ahead. Mr. Johnson's heart clenched as he remembered the optimism they had all felt, the promises of a fresh start and new opportunities. What had gone so terribly wrong? The question haunted him as he finally retreated to his own bedroom, the uneaten cookies left forgotten on the kitchen counter. Sleep eluded him, his mind racing with possibilities, each more worrying than the last. Was it bullies, academic pressure, or something even more sinister that he couldn't begin to fathom? As the night deepened, the Johnson home stood silent, a fortress of unspoken fears and mounting tension. Outside, crickets chirped their nightly chorus, oblivious to the turmoil within. The moon cast long shadows across Maya's bedroom floor, where a single tear-stained notebook lay open, its pages filled with words too painful to speak aloud. In the dark hours before dawn, Mr. Johnson made a decision. He couldn't stand by and watch his daughter's spirit wither day by day. Whatever was happening at that school, he would get to the bottom of it. As the first rays of sunlight began to peek over the horizon, he rose, determination etched into every line of his face. Today, everything would change. Today, He would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Little did he know that his decision would set in motion a chain of events that would shake their community to its very core, exposing hidden prejudices and long-buried secrets. Mr. Johnson's eyes darted to the ceiling, his brow furrowed with concern. The events of the morning still played through his mind on an endless loop. Maya's tear-stained face as she disappeared up the stairs, the sound of her door slamming shut, the oppressive silence that had settled over their once lively home. He had given her space, hoping she would come to him when she was ready. But as the hours ticked by, his worry had only grown. With a deep breath, he called up the stairs, his voice gentle yet tinged with an undercurrent of anxiety. "Maya, sweetheart, dinner's ready." Upstairs, Maya sat cross-legged on her bed, surrounded by a fortress of stuffed animals. At the sound of her father's voice, she flinched, her small hands clutching tightly at the worn teddy bear in her lap. For a moment, she considered pretending not to hear, to remain in the relative safety of her room. But the growl of her empty stomach betrayed her, and with a resigned sigh, she slowly uncurled herself from her protective cocoon. As Maya descended the stairs, each step seemed to echo with an unspoken weight. Mr. Johnson watched her approach, his heart clenching at the sight of her hunched shoulders and downcast eyes. Gone was the bounce in her step, the sparkle in her eye that had once lit up their home. In its place was a shadow, a pale imitation of the vibrant child he knew and loved. "There's my girl," Mr. Johnson said, forcing a cheerfulness he didn't feel into his voice. "I made your favorite, tomato soup with grilled cheese stars." Maya managed a small nod as she slid into her seat at the table. Mr. Johnson placed a bowl before her, the soup garnished with carefully cut cheese stars floating on its surface. It was a whimsical touch that had never failed to bring a smile to Maya's face in the past. Tonight, however, she barely seemed to notice, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the kitchen window. As they began to eat, the silence between them grew thick and heavy. Mr. Johnson searched for words, desperate to bridge the chasm that seemed to have opened up between them. So, he began cautiously, "How was school today?" Maya's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. For a brief moment, her eyes met her father's, and in them, he saw a flicker of something. Fear, pain, before she quickly looked away. "Fine," she mumbled, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Johnson's heart sank. He had hoped that perhaps today would be different, that whatever had been troubling Maya would have resolved itself. But the tension in her small frame told a different story. He pressed on gently. "Did you learn anything interesting?" Maya shrugged, pushing a cheese star around her bowl listlessly. "Not really." The conversation, if it could be called that, continued in this vein throughout the meal. Mr. Johnson's attempts to draw Maya out were met with monosyllabic responses or non-committal shrugs. It was as if a wall had been erected between them, one he couldn't seem to breach no matter how hard he tried. As the meal progressed, Mr. Johnson found himself studying his daughter more closely. There were dark circles under her eyes, a testament to sleepless nights he hadn't even been aware of. Her clothes, usually kept neat and tidy, were slightly rumpled, as if she had been hugging herself tightly throughout the day. And there, just at the edge of her collar, was that a bruise. The thought sent a chill down his spine. He leaned forward, trying to get a better look, but Maya shifted in her seat, the collar falling back into place. Mr. Johnson's mind raced. Had someone hurt his little girl? The idea was almost too painful to contemplate. "Maya," he said, his voice low and serious. "You know you can tell me anything, right? If something's wrong, if someone's bothering you." I said I'm fine. Maya snapped, her sudden outburst shattering the uneasy quiet. Her eyes widened, as if surprised by her own vehemence, and she quickly looked down at her half-eaten soup. Mr. Johnson sat back, stunned. In all her 10 years, Maya had never spoken to him like that. The outburst confirmed what he had feared. Something was desperately wrong. "I'm sorry," Maya whispered, her voice trembling. "Can I be excused?" Before Mr. Johnson could respond, Maya was already pushing back from the table. She fled from the kitchen, her footsteps echoing up the stairs, leaving her father staring after her in helpless confusion. In the sudden silence of the kitchen, Mr. Johnson's mind whirled with possibilities, each more distressing than the last. Was Maya being bullied? Was there trouble with the teacher? Or was it something even worse, something he couldn't even bring himself to imagine? He rose from the table, mechanically clearing away the dishes. The untouched grilled cheese stars seemed to mock him, a painful reminder of happier times that now felt impossibly distant. As he stood at the sink, hands plunged into soapy water, he made a decision. Tomorrow, he would get to the bottom of this, no matter what it took. Upstairs, Maya had retreated once more to the sanctuary of her room. She sat at her desk, a blank sheet of paper before her. Normally, this was where she would pour out her creativity, filling page after page with colorful drawings and imaginative stories. But tonight, the paper remained stubbornly white, as blank and empty as she felt inside. A single tear escaped, rolling slowly down her cheek. It splashed onto the paper, creating a small, imperfect circle. Maya stared at it, transfixed. In that tiny droplet, she saw reflected all the fear, confusion, and hurt she had been carrying for weeks. More tears followed, falling silently onto the paper. Each one felt like a release, a tiny fraction of the burden she had been carrying alone for so long. But with each tear came the sharp sting of memory, the whispered taunts, the cruel laughter, the cold eyes that followed her through the school hallways. Maya's hand moved almost of its own accord, picking up a pencil. As if in a trance, she began to draw. The lines were angry, jagged, nothing like her usual flowing style. On the paper, dark shapes took form, looming figures with sharp teeth and clawed hands surrounding a small, cowering figure that could only be herself. As she drew, the tears fell faster, blurring the lines and smudging the graphite. The image became a chaotic swirl of darkness and fear, a visual representation of the turmoil inside her. When she finally set down the pencil, exhausted, the drawing stared back at her. A nightmare made real on paper. Maya crumpled the drawing in her fist, a sob escaping her lips. She wanted so badly to tell her father everything, to let him chase away the monsters as he had when she was little. But these monsters were different. They wore familiar faces, spoke with friendly voices, and hid behind smiles that never quite reached their eyes. How could she explain to her father that the very place that was supposed to be safe, to help her grow and learn, had become a daily torment? How could she put into words the casual cruelty, the subtle exclusions, the whispered comments that cut deeper than any physical blow? As night fell, casting long shadows across her room, Maya curled up on her bed, clutching her teddy bear close. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to will herself into a dreamless sleep. But even in the darkness behind her eyelids, she could see them, the faces of her tormentors, their mocking laughter echoing in her ears. Downstairs, Mr. Johnson sat in the living room, the TV playing quietly in the background. But his attention was focused entirely on the stairs, straining to hear any sound from his daughter's room. The house felt charged with an unspoken tension, as if balanced on the edge of a precipice. As the clock ticked towards midnight, father and daughter lay awake in their separate rooms, each lost in their own thoughts. Mr. Johnson, determined to uncover the truth and protect his child. Maya, trapped in a web of fear and secrecy she couldn't seem to escape. Neither could have imagined the events that would unfold in the coming days. The truth, when it finally came to light, would shake their family and their community to its very foundations. But for now, in the quiet hours of the night, they were united in their silent vigil, waiting for a dawn that promised both revelation and reckoning. At her locker, Maya fumbled with the combination, her trembling fingers struggling to find the right numbers. A group of girls passed by, their laughter cutting through the air like shards of glass. Maya flinched, her books tumbling from her arms and scattering across the floor. As she knelt to gather them, a pair of pristine white sneakers stopped in front of her. "Need some help?" Maya looked up, her heart racing, to find Emma standing there, a hesitant smile on her freckled face. For a moment, hope fluttered in Maya's chest. Emma had always been kind, one of the few who had never joined in the whispered taunts or cruel jokes. But before Maya could respond, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Emma, what are you doing?" Brittany, the unofficial queen bee of their grade, stood at the end of the hall, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Her eyes narrowed as they flicked between Emma and Maya, lips curling into a sneer. Emma's smile faltered, her gaze darting between Maya and Brittany. The weight of social pressure hung heavy in the air. With a mumbled "sorry," Emma turned away, quickly falling into step with Brittany and her entourage. Maya watched them go, the brief flicker of hope extinguished as quickly as it had appeared. She gathered her books, hugging them to her chest, like a shield as she made her way to her first class. The classroom was a battlefield of a different sort. As Maya slipped into her seat, she could feel the weight of stares on her back. The teacher's voice faded into background noise as she hunched over her desk, trying to make herself as small as possible. A crumpled piece of paper landed on her desk. With trembling fingers, Maya unfolded it, her heart sinking as she read the cruel words scrawled across it. She glanced around, trying to catch the culprit, but was met only with innocently averted gazes and barely concealed smirks. The morning crawled by, each class a test of endurance. Maya answered questions in a whisper when called upon, her usual enthusiasm for learning smothered under the weight of constant scrutiny. She felt like an actor in a play, going through the motions of being a student while inside, she was screaming for help. As the lunch bell rang, Maya's stomach twisted with a mixture of hunger and anxiety. The cafeteria loomed ahead, a chaotic arena of social politics and unspoken rules. She joined the line, tray clutched tightly in her hands, acutely aware of the subtle shifts and whispers as students maneuvered to avoid standing too close to her. With her lunch secured, Maya faced the most daunting challenge of all, finding a place to sit. The cafeteria stretched before her, a sea of tables filled with laughing, chattering groups. Her eyes scanned desperately for an empty spot, somewhere she could eat in relative peace. She spotted a table in the far corner, occupied only by a few scattered backpacks. With a sigh of relief, Maya made her way towards it. But as she approached, a group of girls suddenly materialized, sliding into the seats and spreading out their belongings to take up every available inch of space. Their eyes met Maya's, a challenge clear in their smug expressions. Defeated, Maya retreated to the only refuge left, a small table tucked away near the trash cans. The smell of discarded food wafted unpleasantly, but it was better than the alternative of standing exposed in the middle of the room. As she picked at her food, Maya couldn't help but observe the social dynamics swirling around her. Brittany held court at the center table, her laughter ringing out above the general din. Emma sat at the edge of the group, her smile not quite reaching her eyes as she glanced occasionally in Maya's direction. A commotion near the entrance drew Maya's attention. A new student was being introduced, a tall boy with a shock of red hair. Maya watched with a mixture of sympathy and envy as he was quickly absorbed into one of the groups, welcomed with easy smiles and friendly banter. She couldn't help but wonder, what was it about her that made her so different, so untouchable? The whispers started again, a ripple of murmurs spreading across the cafeteria. Maya didn't need to hear the words to know they were about her. She could feel the weight of stares, the barely concealed pointing. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment and frustration. Suddenly, the cafeteria felt too small, too crowded. The walls seemed to be closing in, the chatter of her peers transforming into a deafening roar. Maya stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. In the sudden hush that followed, she could hear her own ragged breathing, loud in her ears. With as much dignity as she could muster, Maya walked to the trash cans, dumped her half-eaten lunch, and fled the cafeteria. She didn't stop until she reached the girls' bathroom, locking herself in a stall as hot tears spilled down her cheeks. As Maya tried to muffle her sobs, she heard the bathroom door swing open. Footsteps echoed on the tile, then stopped. "Maya." It was Emma's voice, tentative and unsure. "Are you in here? Are you okay?" For a moment, Maya considered responding. The longing for a friendly face, for someone to confide in, was almost overwhelming. But then she remembered Emma's retreat in the hallway, the way she sat with Brittany and the others. With a Herculean effort, Maya swallowed her tears and remained silent. After what felt like an eternity, Emma's footsteps retreated. The bathroom door swung shut, leaving Maya alone once more. The afternoon classes passed in a blur. Maya moved through the halls like a ghost, invisible yet hypervisible all at once. She felt the brush of shoulders as students moved to avoid her, heard the muffled snickers that followed in her wake. Each interaction, or lack thereof, was another small cut, another chip in her already fragile self-esteem. As the final bell rang, signaling the end of another torturous day, Maya felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief that she could escape the suffocating atmosphere of the school, dread at the thought of returning tomorrow to face it all again. She lingered at her locker, taking her time gathering her things, hoping to avoid the crush of students eager to leave. As the halls emptied, Maya finally shouldered her backpack and made her way towards the exit. Just as she reached the doors, a hand grabbed her arm. Maya spun around, her heart pounding, to find Emma standing there, her eyes wide with concern. "Maya, wait," Emma said, her voice low and urgent. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. About earlier and everything." For a moment, hope flared in Maya's chest. But then she saw Brittany and her friends watching from down the hall, their eyes narrowed with disapproval. Emma followed her gaze, her face falling as she realized they'd been spotted. I have to go," Emma mumbled, releasing Maya's arm and hurrying away. Maya watched her go, a familiar ache settling in her chest. She pushed through the doors, stepping out into the afternoon sunlight. The playground was alive with the sounds of children laughing and playing, parents chatting as they waited to pick up their kids. It all felt so normal, so ordinary, that for a moment Maya wondered if she had imagined the whole day. But as she made her way home, the weight of her experiences settled back onto her shoulders. The whispers, the stares, the isolation. It was all too real, too painful to be a figment of her imagination. As Maya turned onto her street, she saw her father's car in the driveway. A small part of her wanted to run to him, to spill out everything that had been happening. But a larger part, the part that had learned to stay silent and small, held her back. How could she explain something she barely understood herself? With a deep breath, Maya straightened her shoulders and plastered on a smile. She had become an expert at hiding her pain, at pretending everything was fine. But as she reached for the front door, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had to give. How long could she keep up this charade before it all came crashing down? Little did Maya know, the events set in motion that day would soon reach a tipping point, forcing long-buried truths into the light and changing the course of her life forever. Mr. Johnson watched his daughter from the corner of his eye, his heart heavy with concern. The vibrant, chatty girl who used to regale him with tales of her school day adventures seemed to have vanished, replaced by this silent, withdrawn shadow. He cleared his throat, searching for words to bridge the chasm that had grown between them. "So, sweetheart," he began, his voice carefully casual, "how was school today? Learn anything interesting?" Maya's fork paused mid-motion, her eyes flickering up to meet her father's for a brief moment before darting away. "It was fine," she mumbled, the words barely audible. "Nothing special." Mr. Johnson's brow furrowed, the familiar ache of helplessness settling in his chest. He opened his mouth to probe further but thought better of it, not wanting to push too hard. Instead, he changed tack. "I was thinking we could read a chapter of your favorite book before bed tonight. How does that sound?" For a fleeting instant, A spark of the old Maya shone through. Her eyes lit up, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. But as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, replaced by a look of, was that fear? Actually, Dad, Maya said, her voice strained, I'm pretty tired. I think I'll just go to bed early if that's okay. Maya's lower lip trembled almost imperceptibly. For a moment, Mr. Johnson thought she might change her mind, might finally open up about whatever was troubling her. But then she shook her head, pushing back from the table. Maybe another time, Dad. Good night. Before Mr. Johnson could respond, Maya had disappeared up the stairs, leaving him alone with a half-eaten lasagna and a growing sense of unease. He sighed heavily, beginning to clear the dishes. As he loaded the dishwasher, his mind raced with possibilities, each more worrying than the last. Later that evening, as the house settled into its nighttime quiet, Mr. Johnson found himself drawn to Maya's room. The door was closed, an unspoken barrier that felt alien and wrong. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated, listening. No sound came from within. No rustling of pages, no whispered conversations with stuffed animals, none of the usual nighttime noises he associated with his daughter. Concern overriding his hesitation, Mr. Johnson gently pushed the door open. The room was dark, save for a sliver of moonlight peeking through the curtains. Maya lay curled up in her bed, her back to the door, seemingly asleep. Mr. Johnson's eyes roamed the room, taking in the familiar sights, the bookshelf, the desk, the art supplies scattered about. Something caught his eye, a shape that seemed out of place in the moonlit room. He moved closer, realization dawning as he picked up Maya's favorite book from the floor. The Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, a book they had read together countless times. But as he held it, he realized something was wrong. The cover hung at an odd angle, and as he opened it, his heart sank. Pages had been torn out, the beautiful illustrations ripped and crumpled. Mr. Johnson's mind reeled. Maya had always treated her books with reverence, often scolding him playfully for dog-earing pages. What could have driven her to destroy something she loved so much? As he moved to place the book back on the shelf, his foot caught on something. Bending down, he found a crumpled ball of paper. Smoothing it out, he felt his breath catch in his throat. The drawing was unmistakably Maya's work, but it was unlike anything she had ever created before. Dark, angry lines formed a small figure, clearly meant to be Maya, standing alone under a looming, ominous cloud. The figure's face was a mask of sadness, tears streaming down its cheeks. Mr. Johnson's hands trembled as he looked around, suddenly noticing more crumpled papers scattered about. He gathered them, each drawing more distressing than the last. Maya alone on a playground, surrounded by laughing shadows. Maya curled up in a corner, monstrous figures towering over her. Maya walking down a hallway, cruel words scribbled all around her. The truth hit Mr. Johnson like a physical blow. These weren't just drawings. They were cries for help, a visual representation of the pain his daughter had been silently enduring. How long had this been going on? How had he not noticed? The soft whimper from the bed snapped Mr. Johnson out of his shocked reverie. Maya stirred, muttering in her sleep, her face contorted in distress. Without thinking, Mr. Johnson moved to her side, gently smoothing her hair back from her forehead. At his touch, Maya's eyes fluttered open, confusion and fear flickering across her face before recognition set in. "Dad," she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. "What's wrong?" Mr. Johnson forced a smile, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. "Nothing's wrong, sweetheart. I just came to check on you. Are you okay?" Maya blinked up at him, and for a moment, Mr. Johnson thought he saw a flicker of something. A desire to confide, to unburden herself of whatever secret she'd been carrying. But then her walls went up, her expression smoothing into a practiced mask of normalcy. "I'm fine, Dad," she said, the words sounding rehearsed. "Just tired." Mr. Johnson hesitated, the crumpled drawings weighing heavy in his pocket. He wanted to confront her, to demand answers, to promise that he could fix whatever was wrong. But the fragility in Maya's eyes held him back. Pushing too hard now might only drive her further away. "Okay, sweetheart," he said softly, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "But you know you can always talk to me, right? About anything, no matter what." Maya nodded, but her eyes wouldn't meet his. "I know, Dad. Good night." "Good night, Maya. I love you." As Mr. Johnson closed the door behind him, the weight of his discovery settled heavily on his shoulders. He leaned against the wall, his mind a whirlwind of worry and self-recrimination. How had he let things get this bad? What kind of father was he, to have missed the signs of his daughter's suffering? In the quiet of the hallway, Mr. Johnson made a silent vow. Whatever was happening to Maya, whatever dark cloud was hanging over her, he would get to the bottom of it. He would protect his little girl, no matter the cost. Little did he know, the journey he was about to embark on would uncover truths far more shocking and painful than he could have ever imagined. The shadows that had been lurking in the corners of their lives were about to step into the light, forever changing the Johnson family and their entire community. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the sleeping neighborhood, a sense of foreboding settled over the Johnson home. In her room, Maya tossed and turned, her dreams plagued by faceless tormentors and endless echoing hallways. And in his study, Mr. Johnson sat surrounded by his daughter's torn drawings, determined to piece together the puzzle of her pain. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake their world to its very foundations. As dawn approached, bringing with it the promise of another school day, neither father nor daughter could have predicted the storm that was about to break over their lives. The truth, when it finally came to light, would leave no one untouched, exposing long-buried prejudices and forcing an entire community to face its darkest secrets. Maya's torn book, the disturbing drawings, her increasing withdrawal. Each piece of the puzzle gnawed at him, refusing to let him find peace in sleep. He turned onto his side, his gaze falling on the empty space beside him. In moments like these, he felt the absence of his late wife most keenly. She would have known what to do, how to reach their daughter in a way that seemed to elude him. Just as his eyelids began to grow heavy, a shrill sound pierced the quiet of the night. Mr. Johnson bolted upright, his heart pounding as he fumbled for his phone on the nightstand. The screen glowed harshly in the darkness, displaying an unfamiliar number. His thumb hovered over the answer button, a strange sense of foreboding creeping over him. Who would be calling at this hour? His mind immediately went to Maya. Had something happened? Was she in trouble? "Hello," he answered, his voice rough with sleep and anxiety. For a moment, there was only silence on the other end. Then, faintly, he heard it. The sound of muffled giggles, whispers too low to make out. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. "Who is this?" Mr. Johnson demanded, fully awake now. "Hello." The giggling grew louder, punctuated by sharp whispers that sounded almost like hisses. Then, abruptly, the line went dead. Mr. Johnson stared at his phone in disbelief, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He quickly dialed the number back, but it went straight to voicemail. A generic, automated message that offered no clues. Sleep was now the furthest thing from his mind. Mr. Johnson got out of bed, padding quietly down the hallway to Maya's room. He eased the door open, peering inside. Maya lay curled up in her bed, her breathing deep and even. For a moment, he simply watched her, his heart aching with love and worry for his little girl. As he closed the door and made his way downstairs, Mr. Johnson's mind raced. The phone call had been unsettling enough on its own, but combined with Maya's recent behavior, it took on a more sinister tone. Was someone targeting his family? Were the issues at school more serious than he had imagined? At the office, Mr. Johnson found it impossible to focus. His mind kept drifting back to Maya, wondering what she was facing at school at that very moment. Was she sitting alone at lunch again? Were other kids whispering about her, excluding her? As the day wore on, his worry only grew. By mid-afternoon, He couldn't take it anymore. He made a decision, one that would set in motion a chain of events he could never have anticipated. Gathering his things, Mr. Johnson left the office early. He drove to Westbrook Elementary, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. As he pulled into the parking lot, the final bell rang, and students began pouring out of the building. Mr. Johnson scanned the crowd, searching for Maya's familiar face. When he finally spotted her, his heart sank. She was walking alone, her shoulders hunched, her gaze fixed on the ground. As he watched, a group of girls passed by her, shooting her looks and whispering behind their hands. Something inside Mr. Johnson snapped. He got out of the car, striding purposefully towards the school. He was done waiting for answers. It was time to get to the bottom of what was happening to his daughter. As he reached the main entrance, a harried-looking woman in a smartly pressed suit nearly collided with him. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone clipped. "Yes," Mr. Johnson said, his voice firm. "I need to speak with the principal. It's about my daughter, Maya Johnson, and it can't wait." The woman's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of, was that recognition? Fear. It passed so quickly, Mr. Johnson wasn't sure he'd seen it at all. "Of course," she said, her professional mask back in place. "Follow me, please." As Mr. Johnson followed her into the school, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into something much bigger and more complex than he had imagined. The hallways seemed to close in around him, the cheerful posters and student artwork on the walls at odds with the growing sense of foreboding in his gut. Little did he know, the conversation he was about to have would blow the lid off a situation that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. The truth, when it finally came to light, would shake not just the school, but the entire community to its core. As the office door closed behind him, Mr. Johnson steeled himself for what was to come. For Maya's sake, he was ready to face whatever darkness lurked in the shadows of Westbrook Elementary. The time for secrets and whispers was over. Now, it was time for answers. The fluorescent lights of Greenwood Grocery Store buzzed overhead. Mr. Johnson stood in the cereal aisle, his hand hovering between two boxes as he tried to remember which one Maya preferred. These days, it seemed like everything he knew about his daughter was slipping away, replaced by a stranger he barely recognized. He sighed, tossing both boxes into his cart. The wheels squeaked as he pushed it down the aisle, his mind a million miles away from the mundane task of grocery shopping. The meeting with the principal earlier that week had left him with more questions than answers. Principal Hawkins had been polite but evasive, assuring Mr. Johnson that they took all student concerns seriously, while simultaneously insisting that they had seen no evidence of bullying or other issues involving Maya. As he turned the corner into the dairy section, Mr. Johnson nearly collided with another shopper. "Oh, I'm sorry," he mumbled, looking up to find himself face to face with a woman in her early 40s, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. The woman's eyes widened in recognition. "Mr. Johnson?" she asked, a hint of surprise in her voice. "Maya's father, right?" Mr. Johnson nodded, confusion creasing his brow. "Yes, that's right. I'm sorry, do I know you?" The woman extended her hand, a warm smile on her face. "I'm Ms. Lopez, Maya's English teacher. I've been meaning to reach out to you, actually. Do you have a moment to chat?" The knot of anxiety that had taken up permanent residence in Mr. Johnson's stomach tightened. He nodded, guiding his cart to the side of the aisle to make room for other shoppers. "Of course, Ms. Lopez. Is everything all right with Maya's schoolwork?" Ms. Lopez's smile faltered slightly, concern flickering in her eyes. "Well, that's part of what I wanted to discuss with you. Maya's always been one of my brightest students, but lately," she trailed off, seeming to search for the right words. "She seems withdrawn, Mr. Johnson, quiet in a way that goes beyond just being shy. I've noticed her sitting alone at lunch, and her participation in class has dropped significantly." Mr. Johnson felt as though the floor had dropped out from under him. Here was confirmation of everything he had feared, everything Maya had been denying. I had no idea," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Maya hasn't mentioned any problems at school. Ms. Lopes nodded sympathetically. Children often try to protect their parents from their troubles. But Mr. Johnson, I've been teaching for over 20 years, and I've seen this kind of behavior before. It usually indicates that something is wrong, something beyond just typical teenage moodiness. A nearby shopper reached between them for a carton of milk, and Mr. Johnson suddenly became aware of their surroundings. The busy grocery store no longer seemed like the right place for this conversation. Ms. Lopes, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you bringing this to my attention. Would you be willing to meet somewhere more private to discuss this further? Of course, Ms. Lopes replied, reaching into her purse for a business card. Here's my contact information. Why don't we meet at Rosewood Cafe tomorrow afternoon? Say, around 4 p.m. Mr. Johnson took the card, clutching it like a lifeline. Thank you, Ms. Lopes. I'll be there. As Ms. Lopes walked away, Mr. Johnson leaned heavily on his shopping cart, his mind reeling. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was more disturbing than he had imagined. He finished his shopping in a daze, barely registering the items he placed in his cart. At the checkout, the cashier had to repeat the total twice before it penetrated the fog of his thoughts. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and stop signs. As Mr. Johnson pulled into the driveway, he saw Maya's silhouette in her bedroom window. For a moment, she stood there, watching him. Then, as if realizing she'd been spotted, she quickly disappeared behind the curtain. Inside, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Mr. Johnson found Maya in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book. But as he approached, he noticed her eyes weren't moving across the page. She was just staring, lost in thought. "Hey, sweetheart," he said softly, sitting down beside her. "How was school today?" Maya shrugged, not looking up from her book. "Fine." Mr. Johnson took a deep breath, steeling himself. "I ran into your English teacher at the grocery store, Ms. Lopes." At the mention of Ms. Lopes's name, Maya's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a mix of emotions Mr. Johnson couldn't quite decipher. Fear, guilt, hope. What did she say? Maya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's worried about you, Maya. Says you've been quiet in class, sitting alone at lunch." Mr. Johnson paused, watching his daughter's face carefully. "Is there something going on at school that you want to talk about?" For a moment, just a fleeting instant, Mr. Johnson thought he saw Maya's walls crumble. Her lower lip trembled, her eyes filling with tears. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, the vulnerability vanished. Maya's face hardened into a mask of indifference. "Ms. Lopes is imagining things," she said, her voice flat. "Everything's fine. I'm just tired. That's all." Mr. Johnson felt his heart breaking. He reached out to touch Maya's arm, but she flinched away, standing up abruptly. "I have homework," she mumbled, fleeing up the stairs before he could say another word. That night, sleep eluded Mr. Johnson. He tossed and turned, his mind replaying every interaction with Maya over the past few months, searching for clues he might have missed. The torn book, the disturbing drawings, the late-night phone calls with eerie giggles. It all pointed to something far more serious than just typical teenage angst. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Mr. Johnson made a decision. He couldn't wait for his meeting with Ms. Lopes that afternoon. He needed answers now. Dressing quickly, he made his way downstairs. Maya was already at the kitchen table, pushing her cereal around the bowl without eating. She looked up as he entered, surprise etching her features. "Dad? Why are you dressed? Don't you have work?" Mr. Johnson shook his head, grabbing his car keys from the counter. "Not today, sweetheart. I'm going to drive you to school." Maya's spoon clattered against the bowl. "What? Why? I always take the bus." "I know," Mr. Johnson said, trying to keep his voice calm and steady. "But I thought it might be nice to spend some time together this morning. Is that okay?" For a long moment, Maya just stared at him, her eyes searching his face. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Okay, Dad." The drive to school was tense, filled with an uncomfortable silence that neither of them seemed able to break. As they pulled up to the drop-off zone, Mr. Johnson turned to his daughter. "Maya, you know you can tell me anything, right? No matter what it is, I'm here for you." Maya's hand froze on the door handle. She turned to look at him, and for a split second, Mr. Johnson saw a flicker of the little girl who used to run to him with skinned knees and bad dreams. But then her expression closed off again, and she was once more the stranger he'd been living with these past months. "I know, Dad," she said softly. "Thanks for the ride." As Maya disappeared into the crowd of students, Mr. Johnson made a split-second decision. Instead of pulling away, he parked the car and got out. He was done waiting for answers. It was time to see for himself what was really going on at Westbrook Elementary. Little did he know, the day that lay ahead would change everything. The truths he would uncover, the allies he would find, and the battles he would face would shake not just his family, but the entire community to its core. As he walked through the school doors, Mr. Johnson couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into the eye of a storm, one that had been brewing far longer than he could have ever imagined. Chapter 7. The Hidden Note. Increasing tension. Summary. Maya accidentally drops a note from her backpack. Mr. Johnson picks it up and reads hurtful messages. "You don't belong here, and go back to where you came from." Disturbed, he realizes his daughter is being bullied. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the Johnson driveway as Mr. Johnson's car pulled up. His mind was still reeling from the conversation with Ms. Lopes at Rosewood Cafe. Her words echoed in his ears. "Mr. Johnson, there's more going on at Westbrook than meets the eye. We need to tread carefully." As he stepped out of the car, the screech of brakes announced the arrival of the school bus. Mr. Johnson's heart clenched as he watched Maya descend the steps, her shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the ground. She looked so small, so vulnerable, a far cry from the vibrant, confident girl she had once been. "Hey, sweetheart," Mr. Johnson called out, forcing cheerfulness into his voice. "How was school today?" Maya's head snapped up, surprise flickering across her face before being quickly replaced by that now familiar mask of indifference. "Fine," she mumbled, brushing past him towards the house. Mr. Johnson followed, his concern deepening with each passing moment. As they entered the kitchen, Maya dumped her backpack on the table with more force than necessary, causing it to tip over. Books, papers, and pencils spilled across the surface, clattering to the floor. "Shoot," Maya muttered, dropping to her knees to gather the scattered items. "Here, let me help," Mr. Johnson said, kneeling beside her. As he reached for a notebook, a folded piece of paper caught his eye. It had fluttered beneath the table, partially hidden by a chair leg. Without thinking, he picked it up. "No, don't." Maya's cry came too late. Mr. Johnson had already unfolded the paper, his eyes widening as he took in the words scrawled across it in harsh, angular handwriting. "You don't belong here, Maya. Go back to where you came from. No one wants you here." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as the full impact of what he was reading hit him. Mr. Johnson felt as though he had been plunged into icy water, his breath catching in his throat. He looked up at Maya, who had gone deathly pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and resignation. "Maya," he breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is this? Who wrote this?" For a moment, it seemed as though Maya might finally open up. Her lower lip trembled, tears welling in her eyes. But then, like a shutter slamming closed, her expression hardened. She snatched the note from his hand, crumpling it into a tight ball. "It's nothing," she snapped, her voice brittle. "Just a stupid joke. I can handle it." "A joke?" Mr. Johnson echoed, disbelief coloring his tone. "Maya, this is bullying. It's racism. We need to talk about this." "No." Maya's shout reverberated through the kitchen. "We don't need to talk about anything. I told you I can handle it." Just, just leave me alone. Before Mr. Johnson could react, Maya had grabbed her backpack and bolted from the room. The sound of her bedroom door slamming echoed through the house, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. Mr. Johnson remained on the floor, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The cruel words on the note played on repeat in his head, each repetition feeling like a physical blow. How long had this been going on? How much had Maya been suffering in silence? With trembling hands, he pulled out his phone, scrolling to Ms. Lopez's number. As it rang, he made his way to his study, closing the door behind him. When she answered, he could barely keep his voice steady. Ms. Lopez, it's David Johnson, Maya's father. I found something. A note. I think Maya's being bullied, and it's worse than we thought. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. When Ms. Lopez spoke, her voice was low and urgent. Mr. Johnson, I was afraid of this. What I told you earlier, it's just the tip of the iceberg. We need to meet again, somewhere private. This goes deeper than you can imagine. I know, Dad, she said softly. Thanks for the ride. As Maya disappeared into the crowd of students, Mr. Johnson made a split-second decision. Instead of pulling away, he parked the car and got out. He was done waiting for answers. It was time to see for himself what was really going on at Westbrook Elementary. Little did he know, the day that lay ahead would change everything. The truths he would uncover, the allies he would find, and the battles he would face would shake not just his family, but the entire community to its core. As he walked through the school doors, Mr. Johnson couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into the eye of a storm, one that had been brewing far longer than he could have ever imagined. Chapter 7. The Hidden Note. Increasing tension. Summary. Maya accidentally drops a note from her backpack. Mr. Johnson picks it up and reads hurtful messages. You don't belong here, and go back to where you came from. Disturbed, he realizes his daughter is being bullied. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the Johnson driveway as Mr. Johnson's car pulled up. His mind was still reeling from the conversation with Ms. Lopez at Rosewood Cafe. Her words echoed in his ears. Mr. Johnson, there's more going on at Westbrook than meets the eye. We need to tread carefully. As he stepped out of the car, the screech of brakes announced the arrival of the school bus. Mr. Johnson's heart clenched as he watched Maya descend the steps, her shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the ground. She looked so small, so vulnerable, a far cry from the vibrant, confident girl she had once been. Hey, sweetheart, Mr. Johnson called out, forcing cheerfulness into his voice. How was school today? Maya's head snapped up, surprise flickering across her face before being quickly replaced by that now familiar mask of indifference. Fine, she mumbled, brushing past him towards the house. Mr. Johnson followed, his concern deepening with each passing moment. As they entered the kitchen, Maya dumped her backpack on the table with more force than necessary, causing it to tip over. Books, papers, and pencils spilled across the surface, clattering to the floor. Shoot, Maya muttered, dropping to her knees to gather the scattered items. Here, let me help, Mr. Johnson said, kneeling beside her. As he reached for a notebook, a folded piece of paper caught his eye. It had fluttered beneath the table, partially hidden by a chair leg. Without thinking, he picked it up. No, don't. Maya's cry came too late. Mr. Johnson had already unfolded the paper, his eyes widening as he took in the words scrawled across it in harsh, angular handwriting. You don't belong here, Maya. Go back to where you came from. No one wants you here. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as the full impact of what he was reading hit him. Mr. Johnson felt as though he had been plunged into icy water, his breath catching in his throat. He looked up at Maya, who had gone deathly pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and resignation. Maya, he breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. What is this? Who wrote this? For a moment, it seemed as though Maya might finally open up. Her lower lip trembled, tears welling in her eyes. But then, Like a shutter slamming closed, her expression hardened. She snatched the note from his hand, crumpling it into a tight ball. "It's nothing," she snapped, her voice brittle. "Just a stupid joke. I can handle it." "A joke?" Mr. Johnson echoed, disbelief coloring his tone. "Maya, this is bullying. It's racism. We need to talk about this." "No." Maya's shout reverberated through the kitchen. "We don't need to talk about anything. I told you I can handle it. Just leave me alone." Before Mr. Johnson could react, Maya had grabbed her backpack and bolted from the room. The sound of her bedroom door slamming echoed through the house, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. Mr. Johnson remained on the floor, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The cruel words on the note played on repeat in his head, each repetition feeling like a physical blow. How long had this been going on? How much had Maya been suffering in silence? With trembling hands, he pulled out his phone, scrolling to Ms. Lopez's number. As it rang, he made his way to his study, closing the door behind him. When she answered, he could barely keep his voice steady. "Ms. Lopez, it's David Johnson, Maya's father. I found something. A note. I think Maya's being bullied, and it's worse than we thought." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. When Ms. Lopez spoke, her voice was low and urgent. "Mr. Johnson, I was afraid of this. What I told you earlier, it's just the tip of the iceberg. We need to meet again, somewhere private. This goes deeper than you can imagine." With hands that trembled slightly, Mr. Johnson picked up the note. "Maya, we can't ignore this anymore. What's written here, it's not just a joke. It's cruel, it's racist, and it's wrong. I need you to tell me what's really been going on at school." Maya's eyes fixed on the note, her face draining of color. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Then, like a dam breaking, the words began to pour out of her. "It's not just notes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's everything. The way they look at me, the things they whisper when they think I can't hear. It's like I'm invisible and too visible all at once." Mr. Johnson felt his heart constricting, a mixture of anguish and fury coursing through him. "Who, Maya? Who's doing this to you?" Maya shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. I can't tell you. They said if I told anyone, it would only get worse. That no one would believe me anyway because," her voice broke, "because I don't belong here." The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Mr. Johnson moved closer, gently taking Maya's hands in his. "Maya, look at me. You belong here. This is your home, your school, your community. No one has the right to make you feel otherwise." A sob escaped Maya's lips, and suddenly she was in her father's arms, her small frame shaking with the force of her tears. Mr. Johnson held her tight, his own eyes burning as he stroked her hair. "Every day," Maya choked out between sobs. "Every single day, Dad. The looks, the whispers, the accidental shoves in the hallway. Sometimes it's just one or two of them, but other times it feels like the whole school is against me." As Maya continued to speak, the full extent of her ordeal began to unfold. The isolation at lunch, the cruel jokes in class, the vandalism of her locker. A systematic campaign of bullying that had been going on for months. Mr. Johnson listened, his heart breaking with each new revelation. "Why didn't you tell me sooner, sweetheart?" he asked softly when Maya's sobs had subsided to quiet sniffles. Maya pulled back slightly, wiping her eyes. I thought I could handle it. That if I just ignored it, they'd get bored and stop. And then I started to wonder if maybe they were right, if I really didn't belong." "No," Mr. Johnson said firmly, cupping Maya's face in his hands. "Listen to me, Maya. You are perfect exactly as you are. Those kids, whoever they are, they're wrong. You belong here just as much as anyone else." A flicker of hope appeared in Maya's eyes, but it was quickly overshadowed by fear. But what if it gets worse? What if telling you just makes everything harder? Mr. Johnson's jaw set in determination. It won't, because we're going to fight this, Maya. Together. I promise you, things are going to change. As the morning light grew stronger, father and daughter sat together on the couch, planning their next steps. Mr. Johnson explained about his conversations with Ms. Lopes, about the suspicion that this problem went deeper than just a few mean-spirited kids. We need to document everything, he told Maya. Every incident, every cruel word. It won't be easy, but it's important. And I want you to know that you can come to me anytime, day or night, if something happens. Maya nodded, a look of resolve settling over her features. For the first time in months, Mr. Johnson saw a glimmer of the strong, confident girl he knew his daughter to be. As they talked, the house came alive around them. The coffee maker gurgled in the kitchen, the newspaper thudded against the front door. The ordinary sounds of a new day beginning seemed at odds with the weight of the conversation they were having. "Dad," Maya said suddenly, her voice small but steady. "There's something else. Something I haven't told you." Mr. Johnson's breath caught in his throat. "What is it, sweetheart?" Maya took a deep breath. "Some of the teachers, I think they know. I've seen them watching when things happen. But they don't do anything. It's like they're pretending not to see." The implications of this revelation hit Mr. Johnson like a physical blow. If the teachers were complicit, even passively, how deep did this problem really go? "Maya," he said carefully, "I need you to be absolutely sure about this. Are you saying that teachers have witnessed you being bullied and done nothing?" Maya nodded, her eyes filling with fresh tears. "Mrs. Simmons saw Brittany push me into the lockers last week. She just walked by like nothing happened. And Mr. Regan, he laughs sometimes when the other kids make jokes about me in class." A cold fury settled in Mr. Johnson's gut. This was no longer just about protecting Maya. This was about exposing a systemic failure, a culture of prejudice that had been allowed to fester unchecked. "Okay," he said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. "Here's what we're going to do. You're not going to school today. I'm going to call Ms. Lopez, and we're going to set up a meeting with the principal. It's time to bring this out into the open." Maya's eyes widened in fear. "But Dad, what if?" "No more what ifs," Mr. Johnson interrupted gently. "We can't live in fear anymore, Maya. It's time to stand up and fight back." As the morning wore on, the Johnson household buzzed with activity. Mr. Johnson made calls, sent emails, and began compiling a detailed account of Maya's experiences. Maya, for her part, began writing down everything she could remember, dates and names spilling out onto the pages of her journal. By the time the school bus rumbled past their house, a plan was in motion. Mr. Johnson had secured a meeting with Principal Hawkins for that afternoon, with Ms. Lopes in attendance as a witness and advocate. As they prepared to leave for the school, Mr. Johnson pulled Maya into a tight embrace. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered. "You're the bravest person I know." Maya hugged him back fiercely. "I'm scared, Dad," she admitted. "I know, sweetheart," Mr. Johnson replied. "But remember, we're in this together. And together, we're stronger than any bully or broken system." As they stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, neither Maya nor Mr. Johnson could have predicted the storm they were about to unleash. The truth, when finally brought to light, would shake Westbrook Elementary and their entire community to its very foundations. But for now, as they walked hand in hand towards the car, there was only the warmth of the sun on their faces and the strength of their shared resolve. The battle for justice was about to begin, and the Johnsons were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, united in their love and determination to create a better world for Maya and all the children who would come after her. Mr. Johnson sat at his desk, the phone pressed tightly against his ear, his knuckles white with tension. On the other end of the line, Principal Hawkins' voice droned on. each word feeling like a carefully crafted deflection. "I assure you, Mr. Johnson," the principal was saying, his tone a mixture of condescension and forced patience, "we take all allegations of bullying very seriously at Westbrook Elementary. But I've spoken with Maya's teachers, and they've reported no unusual behavior or incidents. Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding." Mr. Johnson's free hand clenched into a fist, his nails digging into his palm. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, struggling to keep his voice level. "Principal Hawkins, I found a note. The words written on it." "Children can be cruel sometimes, Mr. Johnson," Hawkins interrupted smoothly. "But without concrete evidence or eyewitness accounts, there's little we can do. Rest assured, we'll keep a close eye on the situation. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting to attend." The line went dead before Mr. Johnson could respond. He sat there, the dial tone buzzing in his ear, a mixture of disbelief and fury coursing through him. How could they dismiss Maya's pain so casually? How could they ignore the evidence right in front of them? From the doorway, Maya watched her father with worried eyes. "What did he say, Dad?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. Mr. Johnson forced a smile, trying to hide his frustration. "He said they'll look into it, sweetheart. But don't worry, we're not giving up. We'll figure this out." As Maya retreated to her room, Mr. Johnson's mind raced. If the school wasn't taking this seriously, he'd have to dig deeper on his own. He pulled out a notebook, jotting down everything he knew so far. The note, the late-night phone calls, the whispers Maya had mentioned. A thought struck him. What if it wasn't just kids from school? What if there was something larger at play here? He remembered the way some neighbors had looked at them when they first moved in, the subtle shifts in conversation when they entered local shops. Could the bullying be extending beyond the school walls? As night fell, Mr. Johnson found himself pacing the living room, unable to shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial. He peered out the window, scanning the quiet suburban street. Everything looked normal. Too normal, almost. Like a facade hiding uglier truths. Suddenly, a flash of movement caught his eye. A car, dark and nondescript, was crawling down the street at an unnaturally slow pace. Mr. Johnson's pulse quickened as he watched it pass their house, then disappear around the corner. He was about to dismiss it as paranoia when, 10 minutes later, the same car reappeared, making another slow pass. As he debated his next move, the car made a third pass. This time, Mr. Johnson was ready. He quickly snapped a photo with his phone, capturing the vehicle's license plate. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The night wore on, a tense vigil punctuated by the mysterious car's regular appearances. Mr. Johnson's mind whirled with possibilities, each more alarming than the last. Were they being watched? Targeted? And if so, by whom? Around midnight, exhaustion finally overcame vigilance. Mr. Johnson slumped in his chair, his eyes heavy but his mind still racing. He was on the edge of sleep when a sound jolted him back to full alertness. The crunch of tires on gravel, right outside their house. Heart pounding, Mr. Johnson crept to the window. The street was empty, but there at the edge of their property, he caught a glimpse of movement. A figure, shrouded in shadow, was bent over their mailbox. Without thinking, Mr. Johnson burst through the front door. "Hey," he shouted, his voice shattering the night's silence. "What do you think you're doing?" The figure froze for a split second, then bolted. Mr. Johnson gave chase, his bare feet slapping against the cold pavement. But the intruder was fast, disappearing into the darkness between houses before Mr. Johnson could close the gap. Panting, Mr. Johnson returned to the mailbox. His hand shook as he opened it, dreading what he might find inside. But there was nothing. No threatening note, no vandalism, just the usual bills and junk mail. As he stood there, confusion and adrenaline coursing through him, a light flicked on in a neighboring house. Mrs. Abernathy, an elderly widow who'd lived on the street for decades, peered out her window. "Everything all right, David?" she called, her voice quavering with concern. Mr. Johnson forced a smile. "Just checking the mail, Mrs. Abernethy. Sorry to wake you." As he trudged back inside, Mr. Johnson's mind was a whirlwind of questions. Who was in that car? What were they looking for? And most importantly, how was it all connected to Maya's bullying? He found Maya at the top of the stairs, her eyes wide with fear. "Dad," she whispered. "What's going on?" Mr. Johnson's heart clenched. How could he explain something he didn't understand himself? "It's nothing, sweetheart," he lied, hating himself for it. "Just a raccoon in the trash. Go back to bed." But as he watched Maya retreat to her room, Mr. Johnson knew he couldn't keep her in the dark much longer. Whatever was happening, it was clear that the danger extended far beyond schooler taunts. They were being targeted, watched, intimidated. But why? Back in his study, Mr. Johnson spread out everything he had. The cruel note, the photo of the license plate, his hastily scribbled observations. It felt like pieces of a puzzle, but one where the picture kept shifting every time he thought he was close to solving it. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Mr. Johnson came to a decision. The school might be turning a blind eye, but he wouldn't. He'd get to the bottom of this, no matter what it took, for Maya's sake, and for the sake of every child who'd ever felt scared and alone. He'd uncover the truth. But as he finally succumbed to exhaustion, slumping over his desk, a chill ran down Mr. Johnson's spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that by pushing forward, by refusing to back down, he was setting in motion events that would change their lives forever. For better or worse, there was no turning back now. Outside, the mysterious car made one final pass, its engine a low growl in the pre-dawn quiet. And in her room, Maya tossed fitfully in her sleep, haunted by dreams of shadowy figures and whispered threats. The battle for truth and justice was about to escalate, and neither the Johnsons nor their quiet suburban community would ever be the same again. As the first rays of sunlight began to pierce the morning mist, Mr. Johnson made a decision. He couldn't sit idle any longer, waiting for answers that might never come. Today, he would take matters into his own hands. "Maya," he called up the stairs, injecting false cheerfulness into his voice. "Time to get ready for school." There was a moment of silence, then the sound of reluctant footsteps. Maya appeared at the top of the stairs, her eyes wary, her shoulders hunched as if bracing for impact. "Do I have to go, Dad?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Johnson's heart clenched at the fear in his daughter's eyes. "It'll be okay, sweetheart," he assured her, hating the lie even as it left his lips. "I promise." As Maya ate her breakfast in silence, Mr. Johnson's mind raced through his plan. He would follow her to school, keeping a discreet distance. Maybe, just maybe, he would finally see for himself what was really happening in the halls of Westbrook Elementary. The school bus rumbled down their street, its yellow bulk a stark contrast to the lingering shadows of the early morning. Mr. Johnson watched from the window as Maya trudged towards it, her backpack seeming to weigh her down with more than just books. As the bus disappeared around the corner, he sprang into action. Grabbing his car keys, Mr. Johnson slipped out of the house and into his sit-in. He knew the route the school bus would take, and he followed at a safe distance, his heart pounding with a mixture of determination and dread. Westbrook Elementary came into view, its brick facade looming against the brightening sky. Mr. Johnson parked across the street, shrouded by the leafy branches of an old oak tree. From this vantage point, he had a clear view of the school's main entrance and the bustling crowd of students flowing towards it. As he watched, everything seemed normal. Kids laughed and chatted in groups. Teachers greeted students with warm smiles. Parents waved goodbye from idling cars. It was a scene of everyday school life. Utterly at odds with the dark undercurrent Mr. Johnson knew lurked beneath the surface. His eyes scanned the crowd, searching for Maya. When he finally spotted her, his breath caught in his throat. She walked alone, her head down, skirting the edges of the throng as if trying to make herself invisible. A group of girls passed by her, their laughter sharp and sudden, and Maya flinched as if she'd been struck. Mr. Johnson's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles white with the effort of restraining himself from rushing to his daughter's side. He had to stay hidden, had to see this through to the end. The morning wore on, the stream of arriving students slowing to a trickle. Mr. Johnson checked his watch. The first bell would be ringing soon. He was about to start the car, resigned to another day of unanswered questions, when movement at the edge of the schoolyard caught his eye. A group of older girls, their uniforms impeccable and their hair perfectly styled, were clustered near the corner of the building. As Mr. Johnson watched, they parted like a curtain, revealing Maya standing in their midst. Even from this distance, he could see the tension in her posture, the way she seemed to shrink into herself. One of the older girls, tall, blonde, with an air of casual cruelty, leaned down to whisper something in Maya's ear. Whatever she said caused Maya to stiffen, her head snapping up in what looked like surprise or fear. Mr. Johnson leaned forward, his nose almost touching the windshield as he strained to see more. The blonde girl was gesturing now, pointing towards a secluded area behind the school, partially hidden by a stand of trees. To his horror, Mr. Johnson saw Maya nod, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. As the group began to move, leading Maya away from the safety of the main entrance, Mr. Johnson felt a surge of panic. This was it, the moment he'd been waiting for, the proof he needed. But at what cost? What were they planning to do to his little girl? Without conscious thought, Mr. Johnson found himself out of the car, his feet carrying him across the street at a run. He barely registered the blare of a horn as a car swerved to avoid him, or the startled looks of the few remaining students on the lawn. "Maya," he shouted, his voice raw with fear and anger. "Maya, stop." Heads turned at his cry. The group of girls froze, their expressions a mixture of shock and something darker, guilt, fear. Maya spun around, her eyes wide with disbelief, as she saw her father charging across the schoolyard. "Dad?" she gasped, her voice trembling. "What are you?" But before she could finish, chaos erupted. The blonde girl grabbed Maya's arm, trying to pull her away. Other students were shouting now, teachers emerging from the building to see what the commotion was about. And through it all, Mr. Johnson ran, his focus narrowed to a singular point, reaching his daughter before it was too late. Just as he was about to close the gap, a figure stepped into his path. Principal Hawkins, his face a mask of professional concern, held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Mr. Johnson," he said, his voice loud enough to carry across the now silent schoolyard. "What seems to be the problem here?" Mr. Johnson tried to push past him, his eyes never leaving Maya. "The problem," he snarled. "The problem is that my daughter is being bullied, and you're all turning a blind eye." A ripple of whispers swept through the gathered crowd. Mr. Johnson saw Maya's face crumple, tears starting to stream down her cheeks. The blonde girl who had been leading her away was now backing up slowly, her eyes darting between Maya and the growing crowd of onlookers. "I assure you, Mr. Johnson," Principal Hawkins was saying, his voice maddeningly calm, "we take all allegations of bullying very seriously. But causing a scene like this is not the way to address your concerns. Why don't we step into my office and discuss this like adults?" But Mr. Johnson was beyond reason now. Months of fear, frustration, and helplessness boiled over in a torrent of rage. "Discuss," he shouted, "while you sit in your office and pretend everything's fine. My daughter is suffering. Look at her." He gestured wildly towards Maya, who was now sobbing openly, her body shaking with the force of her tears. The commotion had drawn more attention. Parents who had been dropping off their children were now getting out of their cars, drawn by the spectacle. Phones were being pulled out, cameras recording the unfolding drama. In that moment, as all eyes turned towards them, Mr. Johnson saw something shift in Maya's expression. The fear and shame that had haunted her for so long gave way to something else, a spark of defiance, of righteous anger. She straightened her shoulders, wiping the tears from her face with a trembling hand. "It's true," she said, her voice small but growing stronger with each word. "Everything my dad said is true. I've been bullied, threatened, made to feel like I don't belong. And when I tried to tell someone, no one listened." A hush fell over the crowd. Mr. Johnson felt a surge of pride for his daughter's bravery, mixed with a renewed determination to see justice done. Principal Hawkins' professional demeanor faltered for a moment, a flicker of something. Panic? Guilt? Crossing his face. "These are serious allegations," he said, his voice no longer quite so assured. "I think it's best if we all calm down and—" But it was too late for calm. The dam had broken, and the truth was flooding out for all to see. As Maya continued to speak, her voice gaining strength and volume, other students began to step forward. Voices rose from the crowd, sharing their own stories of bullying and discrimination, of teachers looking the other way, of a system that had failed them all. Mr. Johnson stood in the eye of the storm, his arm around Maya's shoulders as the carefully maintained facade of Westbrook Elementary began to crumble. He knew that what happened next would change everything. For Maya, for their family, and for the entire community. The battle they had unwittingly stepped into was far from over. But as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the schoolyard, Mr. Johnson felt a glimmer of hope. The truth was finally coming to light, and with it, the possibility of real change. Little did he know, the revelations of that morning were just the beginning. The web of secrets and lies they had uncovered ran deeper than anyone could have imagined, reaching into the very heart of their community. The road ahead would be long and fraught with danger, but for the first time in months, Mr. Johnson felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. With Maya by his side, her courage shining like a beacon, he knew they could weather any storm. The fight for justice had only just begun, but already the winds of change were starting to blow through the halls of Westbrook Elementary. Maya stood with her back against the rough brick wall of the school building, her small frame dwarfed by the circle of older girls surrounding her. Their faces, which had seemed so innocent and carefree just moments ago in the bustling schoolyard, were now twisted with cruel anticipation. The blonde girl, Brittany, Mr. Johnson recalled from Maya's tearful confessions, stepped forward, her perfectly manicured hand reaching out to toy with a strand of Maya's hair. "Well, well," she drawled, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "if it isn't our favorite little diversity mascot. Did you think we'd forgotten about you?" Maya flinched, trying to shrink further into the wall. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "just leave me alone." A chorus of mocking laughter erupted from the group. Another girl, her dark hair pulled back in a severe ponytail, leaned in close to Maya's face. "Leave you alone," she sneered. "But then who would remind you where you really belong?" Mr. Johnson's fists clenched at his sides, his nails digging painfully into his palms. He wanted nothing more than to rush in, to sweep Maya into his arms and shield her from these vicious attacks. But he knew that without concrete evidence, without catching them in the act, nothing would change. The school would continue to turn a blind eye, and Maya would remain trapped in this nightmare. Brittany's hand suddenly shot out, grabbing Maya's chin and forcing her to look up. "Listen closely, you little mutt," she hissed, all pretense of sweetness gone from her voice. "This is our school, our town. You don't belong here, and you never will. So why don't you do everyone a favor and just disappear?" Tears welled up in Maya's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, something shifted in her expression, a flicker of defiance, a spark of the strong, confident girl she used to be. "No," she said, her voice low but steady. "You're wrong. I have every right to be here." For a moment, surprise flashed across Brittany's face. Then her features contorted with rage. She raised her hand, and Mr. Johnson tensed, ready to spring into action. But before Brittany could strike, another voice cut through the tension. "Wait." The group parted, revealing a girl Mr. Johnson hadn't noticed before. She was smaller than the others, with mousy brown hair and thick-rimmed glasses. There was something different about her, a hesitance in her stance, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "What is it, Emma?" Brittany snapped, clearly annoyed at the interruption. Emma fidgeted with the hem of her shirt, her eyes darting between Maya and the other girls. I don't think we should do this anymore," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not right." A hush fell over the group, the air crackling with tension. Brittany turned slowly, her eyes narrowing, as she regarded Emma. "Not right," she repeated, her voice dangerously soft. "And what exactly isn't right about putting this little interloper in her place?" Emma swallowed hard, but stood her ground. "All of it," she said, her voice growing stronger. "The bullying, the threats, the slurs. It's cruel and it's wrong. And I won't be part of it anymore." Mr. Johnson felt a surge of hope. Here, finally, was an ally for Maya, someone brave enough to stand up against the tide of hatred. But his relief was short-lived. Brittany's laugh was cold and sharp. "Oh, Emma," she said, shaking her head in mock disappointment. "I always knew you were weak. But I never thought you'd be stupid enough to cross us. Or have you forgotten who's really behind all this?" Emma paled, taking a step back. I don't know what you mean," she stammered. "Don't play dumb," Brittany snapped. She turned back to Maya, a cruel smile twisting her lips. "You want to know the truth, little Miss Diversity. Why don't you ask your precious Ms. Reynolds why she's been turning a blind eye to all of this?" Maya's eyes widened in shock. "Ms. Reynolds," she gasped. But she's always been so nice to me." Brittany's laugh was like shards of glass. "Nice? Oh, that's rich. Tell me, Maya, has your mommy ever mentioned working with dear Ms. Reynolds? Maybe? Oh, I don't know. Competing for the same job?" Mr. Johnson felt as though the ground had dropped out from beneath him. He remembered, years ago, his wife mentioning a particularly bitter colleague who had been passed over for a promotion. But surely it couldn't be the same person. Maya shook her head, confusion and hurt warring in her eyes. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Let me spell it out for you," Brittany said, her voice dripping with malice. "Ms. Reynolds has been orchestrating this whole thing from the beginning. Every accidental shove, every misplaced assignment, every teacher who conveniently looked the other way. It was all her. She's been using us to get back at your mother through you." The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Mr. Johnson's mind reeled, pieces of the puzzle suddenly snapping into place. The school's reluctance to address the bullying, the teacher's willful blindness. It all made a terrible, sickening sense. Maya's face crumpled, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. But why?" she choked out. "What did I ever do to her?" "You existed," Brittany said coldly. "You were a constant reminder of what she lost, of how your mother stole her dream job. And now you're going to pay the price." As Brittany raised her hand again, Mr. Johnson knew he couldn't wait any longer. He burst from his hiding place, his voice thundering across the playground. "Get away from my daughter." The group scattered like startled birds, their faces masks of shock and fear. Maya, seeing her father, let out a sob of relief and ran into his arms. Mr. Johnson held her tight, his eyes blazing with fury as he surveyed the retreating bullies. "This ends now," he growled, pulling out his phone. "I've recorded everything. Every word, every threat. And I'm taking this straight to the school board. No, to the police." Brittany, her face pale with fear, backed away. You can't prove anything," she stammered. "It's your word against ours." But Mr. Johnson wasn't listening. He was already dialing, his voice steady as he reported what he'd witnessed. As he spoke, he saw movement at the edge of the playground. Ms. Reynolds stood there, her face a mixture of shock and something darker, guilt, fear. She turned and fled back into the school building. But Mr. Johnson knew it was too late. The truth was out, and there would be no more hiding. As the sound of approaching sirens filled the air, Mr. Johnson held Maya close, murmuring words of comfort and love. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope. The truth had finally come to light, and with it, the chance for real justice and healing. Little did he know, the revelations of that morning were just the beginning. The web of lies and prejudice they had uncovered ran deep, stretching far beyond the walls of Westbrook Elementary. But as Mr. Johnson stood there, his daughter safe in his arms, and the weight of the truth finally lifting from their shoulders, he knew they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, its rays piercing through the dense foliage surrounding the secluded corner of Westbrook Elementary's playground. The air, once thick with tension and cruel words, now crackled with a different kind of energy, the electric anticipation of long-awaited justice. Mr. Johnson stood tall, his arm protectively wrapped around Maya's shoulders, his other hand clutching his phone like a lifeline. The device's screen glowed with the damning evidence he had just captured, a video that would shatter the carefully constructed facade of normalcy at Westbrook Elementary. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice cut through the stunned silence that had fallen over the playground. This is David Johnson, he spoke, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. I'm at Westbrook Elementary School. I need to report an assault and a conspiracy involving the bullying and racial harassment of my daughter, as well as the involvement of a teacher in orchestrating these acts. As Mr. Johnson relayed the details to the dispatcher, Maya clung to him, her body trembling with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. The group of girls who had moments ago been her tormentors now stood frozen, their faces pale with the realization of the gravity of their actions. Brittany, the ringleader, took a hesitant step forward. Mr. Johnson, please, she began, her voice quavering. We were just what? Mr. Johnson cut her off, his eyes flashing with barely contained fury. Just tormenting my daughter. Just making her life a living hell. Just carrying out the vindictive plans of a bitter, racist teacher. The girl flinched as if struck, stumbling back into the protective circle of her friends. Emma, the one who had shown a glimmer of conscience, stood apart from the others, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and relief. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. A flurry of activity erupted from the main building of the school. Teachers and students poured out onto the lawn, drawn by the commotion and the unmistakable wail of police vehicles. Among the crowd, Mr. Johnson spotted a familiar face. Ms. Reynolds. The teacher's composed facade crumbled as their eyes met across the playground. In that moment of recognition, of knowing that her carefully orchestrated revenge plot had been exposed, Ms. Reynolds turned to flee. Stop that woman, Mr. Johnson shouted, pointing towards the retreating figure. She's the teacher behind all of this. Two male teachers, responding to the urgency in Mr. Johnson's voice, moved to block Ms. Reynolds' escape. She struggled against their grip, her face contorted with a mixture of rage and fear. You don't understand, she shrieked. That woman stole everything from me. Her daughter doesn't deserve. Her words were cut off as the first police car screeched to a halt at the school's entrance. Officers poured out, their faces set with grim determination as they took in the chaotic scene. Principal Hawkins pushed through the crowd, his face ashen. Mr. Johnson, he began, his voice strained. I assure you, if we had any idea. Save it, Mr. Johnson snapped, his patience finally at its end. You had every idea. Maya tried to tell you, I tried to tell you, and you chose to look the other way. Well, now you're going to have to look this ugly truth right in the face. As the officers approached, Mr. Johnson held out his phone. I have video evidence of the bullying and the confession implicating Ms. Reynolds, he said, his voice steady. And my daughter is ready to give her statement about everything she's endured. Maya, still pressed against her father's side, looked up at him with a mixture of fear and determination. I'll tell them everything, Dad, she said, her voice small but resolute. No more hiding. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Statements were taken, evidence was collected, and the gravity of the situation began to sink in for everyone involved. The girls who had participated in the bullying were led away, their once confident demeanors replaced by shock and fear as the consequences of their actions became clear.